I showed 7 security researchers how to audit and uncover critical bugs with a method that I like to call the GTDA method. And now, of course, I'm bringing this training to you so that you can go and you can use this method to audit protocols and find, hopefully, as many critical bugs as possible. So in this video, we're going to cover what are the steps of GTDA, what does GTDA even mean, what does it stand for, and then you're going to get to see the questions that these security researchers asked me about the method and how they could implement it into their workflow. And so hopefully you can take this and you can take the answers I gave to their questions and you can use it to implement it in your own auditing approach. And hopefully it will give you exactly what you need to find as many high and critical vulnerabilities as possible. So, of course, before we jump into the GTDA method, my name is Owen, and over 2 years ago now, I founded Guardian Audits, and ever since then we've uncovered dozens and dozens and dozens and even over 100 different critical vulnerabilities to this date. And we've done that by auditing over 1,000 different smart contracts. And personally, I've spent probably a few thousand hours at this point auditing smart contracts. And so my goal with this channel and all of the videos that I put out, and especially this one, is to give you everything that I've experienced thus far and distill it down, give it to you so that you can ultimately become a much, much more effective security-minded blockchain engineer, blockchain security researcher, whatever it is you're looking to be in a fraction of the time. So with that being said, let us get into the GTDA method and see how can we improve our auditing approach and how can you find critical vulnerabilities as effectively as possible. Let's get into it. So today we're going to go through really the high-level approach that we have been developing for the past, I guess, 2 years now, of how to effectively audit and how to not get overwhelmed, how to dig in and do the right things at the right time when you're in the midst of an audit. And we're going to introduce the GTDA system that we have developed at Guardian, and we're gonna learn what each of those are. But before we even get into the GTDA system, I'm going to talk about some high level things about auditing that inform how we approach it, and then also just talk about how do we audit effectively, efficiently, and everything like that. So first of all, I want to talk about what vulnerabilities commonly are. Like, I think there's a common misunderstanding that security is, oh, I just go and I learn what the types of vulnerabilities are, and then I can go and find stuff in code bases now. There's some truth to that, but I would say that, that's really not what vulnerabilities are at the crux of, at least in our experience, what we find at Guardian. It's not like you can just go and learn stuff. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what vulnerabilities commonly are, what kind of skills you need to have there. And then we're going to get into how do we approach auditing, first of all, in a sense of being productive with our time and getting the most out for the work that we put in. And then we're going to follow that with a full rundown of the GTDA system, which we've developed at Guardian. And then we're going to walk through exactly what you should do when we're approaching the Ethernote prepared audit. So the approach that you guys can take there, and then we'll walk through how you guys should be applying GTDA to that prepared audit. So what are vulnerabilities, right? Like when we actually go into a real audit and we actually want to start uncovering vulnerabilities, what is that actually going to look like, right? So I touched on it a little bit already, but yes, it is important to know, like, this is what a reentrancy attack is, this is what a DOS attack is, and, sort of build out what I like to call your toolbox of things that you can go in and you can reach in and start to manipulate things in the code base and ultimately use that to get findings. That is like one piece of having a fully built out toolkit or a fully built out skill set for finding vulnerabilities. So the first thing I'll say here is, it's not memorization of a bunch of edge cases, or attacks or anything like this. that's one part. It's not just memorization of this, right? That is not what's going to enable you to actually find interesting vulnerabilities, especially if you go into a contest, right? If you go into a contest and you just submit like, oh, you didn't use safe transfer from or something like this, you're going to get like 2 cents for that, right? The actual crux of what are vulnerabilities and how do we actually find them is more often than not, you'll see they're just straight up bugs or logical errors, right? They're just edge cases that are more often than not extremely unique to the code base, and they just simply can't be a cookie cutter like system, or it's not something you memorize. Very, very rarely does it work out like that, because if it's something that you can just memorize and they're just rules, then hypothetically you could just put that into an AST parser, or you could put that into an AI model, and they would just solve it for every code base, right? But of course, nobody has done that yet for smart contract security, because that's not the way smart contract security works, right? There are, of course, bot racers and things like that, but they get all the minor issues that we're going to get duped to hell anyways, right? So, I mean, on one hand, it kind of sucks that we can't just memorize a bunch of things and then apply them to a code base, because it's harder. And I mean, that's one of the main reasons why it's really hard to scale a really huge security company, right? If you do, you become CERTIC, and everybody knows what happens with CERTIC. But on the other hand, that means that there will always be opportunity for many people to be able to develop this skill and earn a high income, live, the lifestyle that they want, et cetera, et cetera. Because you can't automate it, right? It can't be automated by AI. It can't be automated by an AST parser. And more importantly, one person cannot do 10 audits, right? So there's this flattening effect of there will always be opportunity for anybody who has this skill set, right? Because there's like a bottleneck built into the nature of the service. So that's a long way to say that really understanding the code base at a deep level, so understanding the code base at a deep level, that is the key. That's the most manual intensive part of the audit, is understanding, what the developers were thinking, why they structured it a certain way, and getting over that initial context, getting the context of the code base, and then being able to dive in and find, oh, here are the actual interesting edge cases. Here are the actual vulnerabilities that will actually affect the system. And then you'll actually be able to see what the net effect is, right? So, of course, how do we actually come to be able to understand these code bases at a deep level? Well, we need to, of course, understand what is the thing doing. We need to understand that goal at a deep level, right? So of course that's a part of what we're doing with CDPs, right? We need to understand the actual DeFi concept of what it is at a deep level. And then now you guys will start to see, when we start looking at other CDP code bases, now that you guys have gone through the steps of deriving this thing from first principles, you're going to have a look at another CDP code base and you're going to see, oh, this is different than how I thought through it. And oh, that seems off. We handled this edge case, or they're not thinking about this, or something like this, right? So understanding these DeFi concepts really in depth, right, and being able to really touch and feel the formulas and understand why things are at a base level, right? This is really the core of where vulnerabilities are. Now, on top of this, we do want to actually go and build out our toolbox, because we'll see how our toolbox actually becomes useful in just a minute. But really, we need to be able to get to a point where we can get into any code base, get to understand it as fast as possible. Then and only then can you actually leverage your toolbox of, edge cases and attacks that you personally know of to actually go and break stuff. So before we move on to auditing approach in terms of productivity, do you guys have any questions on that section there?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So, by understanding the code base, do you mean that we should know how a protocol should be implemented securely? And then, now that we know that, what are the where the things can go wrong when we audit other protocols, we can notice that pattern.
Yeah, it's not even necessarily that we should know this is what it looks like when it's secure. It's just so that we should know this is what this protocol is trying to do, and this is why it's trying to do it, right? So we need to understand if I come and ask you to audit a perpetuals protocol, it would be a lot more helpful if you previously had experience diving into perpetuals and understanding it from first principles. And the best way to understand perpetuals and to not like I can tell you what perpetuals is. I can give you the formulas behind it and I can walk you through examples, but that is a surface level understanding, right? You need to actually go and take that and apply that to code so that you can see, oh, this is literally how, this works, or this is the issue that you run into when you try to decrease the position and account for fees and stuff like this, right? So it's not literally, I know what this looks like when it's secure. It is, I know what this looks like in general, right? I understand what this protocol is and what it's trying to do. So I guess does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and that way you'll just be able to dive into the code base without some initial fog already, right? So the number one enemy that we have as auditors is the fog when we dive into a no code base. I really think auditing is just the skill of reading and understanding DeFi code bases. That's really all it is. Then on the back of that, you add an attacker's mindset and a toolbox of potential vulnerabilities. That's the easy and fun part. The hard part is understanding the code base and then, you know, getting everything mapped out and having a mental model for things. And then you get to have fun, you get to be creative, and you get to actually find the cool bugs.
So
Yeah.
the more code bases we have looked at, we can audit similar code bases faster, like get into the attacker mindset faster, right? Because we know
100%.
how it should work.
Yeah, and that's where all the ROI is, right? So as soon as you get over the period of understanding a code base, that's when you can actually start finding stuff, right? I'm sure you guys, if you've hopped into some contests, you might have spent some time and been like, this looks like it's wrong, but I have no idea if it's wrong, or something like that. It's like I don't know if this is a finding. That's a sign of you're still in that first phase of getting to understand a code base, right? So as soon as we can get out of that phase and get into the second phase, which is an understanding and now thinking about those edge cases and using your toolbox, that's where the findings are made. That's where the money is made. That's where the results are delivered. So our enemy is that initial barrier to get into that phase. So yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so let's first of all just talk about audit productivity before we talk about the actual approach to auditing and the GTDA system. So first of all, this should just be, baseline is just to remove all distractions. And this is extremely important, right? If you have Discord open and you're getting pinged left and right, this happens to me all the time. It's extremely hard to get into a point of focus. And I find that if I am distracted, I can spend like 5 hours and literally not break through any barriers. But in 1 hour of completely focused time, I can really dig in and absolutely crush a code base, like absolutely be able to walk through and start understanding things way faster, right? And building the mental models that are necessary way faster. So first of all, just removing all distractions, right? I'm sure that is more of an obvious thing, but it is like I can't overstate it enough. Just have only the code base window and then maybe a notepad. We'll get into how we use that. But yeah, no distractions. Okay. Second of all is to have, sessions, like have blocks of time, periods of time where you're like, I'm doing this right now, right? You're either doing it and you're doing it 100% or you're not doing it. You're not kind of doing it watching TV, you got TV on the background. No. Just if you're going to be auditing, that is time that you're spending auditing and actually making progress. And then when you're not, you're relaxing, you're cooling off afterwards. Like those two things right there, you'll see a huge boost in your performance and your ability to start to understand these code bases. I can personally guarantee you that. So what I like to do is I like to have 60-minute sessions. I like to have a timer. So if it gives you anxiety, you might not choose to have a timer, but I like to have a timer. It just reminds me every time I start to feel my mind wandering, Sometimes when you start to approach something in the code base that's like, ooh, that's kind of hard. I don't want to think about that. Your mind starts to wander. And if you actually pay attention and you watch it, you can start to see exactly when that starts to happen to you. You might come up against some math, or you have to start thinking about decimals, and man, those are not the easy things to think about, right? I got to get out a whiteboard. I got to start working through this stuff, right? So I got to catch myself, and having that timer ticking for me just helps me be, in the moment and aware when my mind starts to kind of shy away and, oh, I don't want to think about that. I want to go think about this. Let me go think about some other irrelevant stuff. So figuring out when your mind starts to do that and dragging yourself back and sort of pushing through those hard steps, that is key. And having a timer personally helps me with that. So you might consider actually having a timer. And then finally, I'll say we need to set goals, right? We need to set goals and have a notepad during our session. So you saw me do this with Kelp, the live session that we did last week. This has been absolutely key to, like we said with the sessions, just orienting me and making sure I'm not wandering through the code base and keeping me on track, right? Because the number one enemy to getting over the context phase is just not being effective and not knowing what to do. And it's very easy to get lost when you open a code base and it's like 8,000 lines of code, right? You don't even know where to start, right? So you just start meandering. That's just a waste of time, right? You're literally not achieving any set goals. You're kind of just glazing over the code. We want to avoid that as much as possible. So the third thing I'll add here is we want to set goals and have a notepad. So any questions on that? Do those make sense to folks?
Yes, sounds
Yeah.
perfectly reasonable, I would say.
Great, great. And once again, I'll also put all of this in school, so you guys will have all of these notes after we finish, and then also this will be recorded as well. Yeah, what's up?
So, like, let's say you have a 60-minute session, and I don't know, like, last 5 minutes you find something big. Like, do you still like go away and relax a little bit, or you like, I don't know, just keep going?
Well, I'm an animal. I'll set the timer for 60 minutes. Then when it gets to zero, I'll just set it back at 60 minutes. And I'll do that like 3 times in a row. So really, I'll go like 3 hours in a row. Sometimes that's when we're really busy and stuff's got to get freaking done. Um, so yeah, I mean, if I'm in the middle of something, I'll just set the timer back up and I'll do another session. But I mean, that's up to you. Everybody has their different capacity of like, okay, after I do an hour, I'm burnt. I need to step away for 5, 10, 15 minutes. So if that's you, I would say figure out what works best for you, right? Of course, if I'm in the middle of something and, I'm hooked and I'm feeling it and, I'm feeling progress, don't stop it, right? Why force it to stop? But I think definitely if you're not in a place where you're in the middle of something, then yeah, stop, take 5 minutes, take 10 minutes and come back after you've, maybe you've had something to eat or just had some time to get out, maybe go for a walk or something like that, clear your mind, and then you can come back, you can be super effective. So I'm not super strict with it in terms of the timer is up, I'm done, but it just helps me to see that time is ticking down and it's time to be focused. But yeah, I guess, does that answer your question?
Yep, thanks.
Okay, cool, cool. Yeah, and also on the notepad, so I'll just actually go and write out what an example notepad that I use. This is just always a setup that I use. We can write that out. And of course, I mean, just figure out what works for you. But this is what I like to have is, first of all, I have goals at the top, and we'll see exactly how we go through and assign goals and stuff. And then just have a section for notes, and finally findings. And so throughout my sessions, we at Guardian, we track our findings in Discord. We open like a thread, and you guys will see as we continue on how we do that. So I used to have Discord open to be able to put findings in as I got them, but it's distracting, when you hear that little like notification sound. So I keep all of my findings tracked here. So I'll like go and let's say like, oh, something in the Exchange router on line 102, and then here's the description, dot dot dot, and then here's the recommendation dot, dot, dot. And then at the end of my session, I'll go and I'll copy and paste all these into threads in Discord, just so I don't have to have Discord open. But yeah, this is what my notepad usually looks like. So let's get into the GTDA system. So when we're first getting into an audit, we need to get over this initial phase of understanding the code base. So the first thing we need to do is we need to break that down into goals, right? So just like we set up here, we're going to have goals, and that's going to help you with each session. But more importantly, this is initially to first get an understanding of the system. So your initial goals that you set for your sessions or whatever are going to be basically hinged on what does the system do. So we'll think like, what does the system do? Break that into features, right? So if this is a CDP protocol, I know there are some distinct features, right? There's going to be borrowing capability. There's going to be repaying capability. There's going to be add collateral, remove collateral, and there's going to be some liquidation, something along the lines of this. If it's a CDP protocol, I'm expecting to see these 5 functionalities here, right? And this changes based on what type of protocol it is, obviously. And sometimes you might not even know what the hell you're looking at. They're all basic, like, okay, this is borrow lending, this is liquid staking, but now they're just using more terminology and it's hard to even figure out what each protocol is. So honestly, to figure out what a protocol is and what some of these goals are, one of the hacks I found is obviously, first of all, read the docs and maybe scan the code, but also look at Twitter, right? I've actually found it really useful. Like, what are they even marketing themselves as? Like, you see, if you just hop into the code base and you're trying to figure out what is this thing, it's like oftentimes it's pretty hard to guess. Like, guess this DeFi protocol by the code, right? So what I found is like, yeah, just go check out their Twitter, go check out their user-facing documentation, see what the users are marketed to be able to do, and then write those down, right? So whatever they have in their user documentation or on their website, those are features, right? So if you go on their website and you notice that there's lending, okay, well there's a feature, right? People are probably able to borrow. And somebody's actually lending that out. Those are features to write down. So the goals initially are just features of the system, right? I want to go and I want to figure out how do these things work in the code. Next, what I'll do is I'll, of course, briefly read through the docs. I don't spend too much time in the docs, just to understand a little bit more on each of these goals, whatever information they have, and then also scan the code. I want to just get a look at all of the files individually, just have a look at, what's in store. I don't want to immediately dive in and be like really up close looking at some liquidate function and like there's all this code around me and I've not looked at it, but I'm just like really focused in on this liquidate function. No, personally, I found that it's a lot more helpful to scan every single file and just have a look at what kind of functions are in each contract. Of course, I'm not going to have any idea what any of that does right now, but just to understand this is where most of the logic is in this contract here, or, this is what we're dealing with over here. And also just to be able to scope out and see like, okay, here's what's on my plate with this audit. And just get all that out of the way. It's kind of like ripping off the Band-Aid. Just like, okay, just let me look at everything that's in scope here so I can get an idea of what we're diving into. So these are what my initial goals will be, is literally just features of the system. And then what I'm going to go and do is I'm going to actually walk through and go through the code paths for each one of these things, right? So I'm going to start off with probably add collateral is where I would start. It depends on the system, obviously. And I'm not going to know exactly where that is, right? So I'm going to go to the documentation. I'm going to see, ideally, they have some point where it's like, this is where users call. And then you can go to that contract. You can figure out, okay, this is where they add collateral. Sometimes documentation sucks, right? So I'm not going to know where to go. So at that point, what I'll do is I'll look for something called like a router I'll look for, I'll honestly just look through all of the contracts to see like, is there an external function called deposit or, add collateral, stuff like that. If you're literally going in blind and the documentation really sucks, that's what you do. You just have to enumerate all of the external functions and sort of like feel around until you catch that initial starting point. And then you can follow that starting point like a thread and see how this actually happens in the code, right? So I'll say, okay, this is adding collateral. Now it's time to actually walk through the call path of like, okay, this is what contracts are being called. This is what logic is being done, and actually walking through and getting to know the system this way, right? This is how we understand the contracts with context, right? At one point, I used to try to just, read functions and just understand what functions were doing. It was way harder because I was like, I didn't know what it was trying to achieve what it was doing, and I didn't know why it was trying to do what it was doing. But now if I framed it in this way, where I was attacking each thing from the sense of, okay, we're trying to add collateral with this function, now all of a sudden stuff became a lot easier for me in terms of understanding. But of course, to be able to get that framing, we need to have the pre-context of, okay, I understand DeFi systems and I understand this is what adding collateral means, and this is why you have to add collateral and stuff like that. So you know what to expect, right, going into these systems. The next point here is, of course, just walking these code paths, right? And this is how you accomplish these goals. These goals are basically saying, I want to understand how borrowing works. I want to understand how repaying works and stuff like this. So that brings us to the T here, which is tags. So as you're walking these code paths, you're going to notice things. You're going to have questions. You're going to think of edge cases. None of that is important right now. So you want to just make tags for questions, potential vulnerabilities. You're going to have an idea for an attack as you're walking through, and you need to resist digging into that and going into that rabbit hole. You absolutely have to, because you're just going to waste a ton of time because you don't know how the system works right now. So for questions, potential vulnerabilities, and edge cases, just make tags. So go @audit, make an @audit tag, and just leave that in the code, like you saw me do with the kelp audit. Leave that there so that you can grep for it later and come back to that after you understand what's going on in the code base. If you try to dig into a particular question you have, or an edge case, or a potential vulnerability at this stage in the audit, you're going to end up spinning your wheels and not really going anywhere directly. So what I try to do, even, honestly, when I open a code base, I don't even try to look for vulnerabilities or do anything like that. If I notice stuff, I'll leave it a tag, but my goal is 100% locked in, trying to just understand the code. And then when I come back to these things, these questions, vulnerabilities, edge cases, I can just answer these in like a minute or two because or immediately, right? I'll just know, oh yeah, well, that's actually not an issue because of this. Or that is an issue, and I think I have a knob over here that I can turn to make this an issue when I combine these two edge cases together or something like this. So that is really what we want to use tags for. We want to use tags for focusing on getting context, putting these tags in our backlog to look into. Now, as we're going through the code base, oftentimes if it's a really complex code base, we especially want to do this. The third thing is to diagram. So often as I'm walking through these code paths, what I'm going to do is actually we can go and see what some of these diagrams look like. I'll go ahead and get some of these up. I like to use Woopsicle. You guys can go to Woopsicle. You can sign up. Look, here's a diagram I was literally in the middle of making here. So right now we are doing an engagement for the GMX V1 system because they're going to be making some updates there. So this is I'm starting to make a diagram here. So there's a lot of different paths here. GMX V1 is a more complex system. It's not the most complex system, but it's more complex. In that system, there's like a central vault. And then there's all these different ways of interacting with the vault. So for example, here's a feature, here's a goal that I had was to understand how to mint GLP, right? And that's how you basically provide liquidity to be used in the vault. So I went through and I walked through the contracts. As I was walking through and looking through the call stack and the execution path, I mapped out, okay, we start in this contract, which I had to just kind of figure out. Then we go to this contract and, we call this add liquidity for account function. And then we call buy USDG on the vault, right? And I did this for all of these features. So here's how create order works, execute order, and there's another pathway for executing positions for, whatever reason. But this is one that's not fully built out yet. Let's see if I have one for Dolomite, because Dolomite is hefty. Here it is. All right. So this is Dolomite. So this one is Dolomite's probably it's the most confusing complex code base that I've had a privilege of looking at. They use inheritance to the nth degree. They use a lot of inheritance with their contracts and stuff, so it's very confusing. But so I had to go ahead and map out and say okay, you're going to call, this is the entry point to the system. You're going to call the vault, and then we're going to call this generic trader proxy, which is in their margin repo. We're going to come and we're going to call operate on the Dolomite margin contract. And then we're going to come in here and we're going to do these two things in that operate function. We're going to, call into this, and we're going to do all that. That's deposit. And then here's withdraw. Withdraw is even worse. So I've got all this stuff mapped out here. But there is literally no way that I would have all this stuff in my mind without mapping this out, right? Like, there's no way, right? Especially when I'm just getting into the system. This is the only way I was able to work through it, right? Do it piece by piece. Like, it looks really complex here, but I was literally just building this brick by brick. And that's how we break a code base down, a really complex one, and make it a lot more digestible. So diagrams are huge for breaking a complex code base down. And then also having an artifact to discuss the code base with others, right? So you can hand this to somebody and say, hey, here's how I understand the system. And they can poke and prod at it. They can tell you where you're wrong. And also it helps them understand the system, right? So diagrams are absolutely huge, especially if you want to start auditing with a team. That's something that you do once and it benefits everybody, and everybody can add to it. So diagrams are indispensable. Once again, I recommend using Woopsicle. I like, they look pretty clean. Not this one, but if they're more simple, they're cleaner. Now, after these first three things, this is all the painful, hard part. Now we get to the fun part, which is to attack. Right? This is the fun one. This is the one we all want to get to, and this is where we make the money. This is where we get the findings. But you got to go through these first three things first to be able to get over that context phase. And you can see this is 75% of the GTDA method is getting over the context phase, right? So that's why we're putting all of our effort and energy into giving you the skills to be able to get over that as fast as possible. So now is attack. And this is where your toolbox comes in. Only at the end is it now important that you understand what a reentrancy attack is, that you understand what a DOS attack is, and things like this. So when I said they're important, but they're not everything, this is what I meant, right? It's the last 25%. It's the icing on top. But you can only get to that, and you can only actually use it once you understand DeFi protocols and you understand, the code base that you're looking at in this moment. So after we finish all the initial goals and we've walked through all the paths of the system, you should at this point have a really solid understanding of the system. Now we're going to go back to audit tags. So we're going to go back to audit tags, and now you're going to have a look at your edge cases, your questions, your potential vulnerabilities. You're going to, a ton of them are just going to be straight up invalid. After you go back and look at them, you're going to be like, oh, wow, I didn't understand this code base at all. And then cool, we can just delete those tags. Some of them will be interesting. So you want to actually go through the interesting ones and explore those further, right? If you had an initial idea for a reentrancy, now is the time to think about that, right? And actually go through and use your toolbox, right? At a certain point, you're going to get through all of your audit tags and actually, basically run out of audit tags and initial questions that you had. So now we go through our second pass. And this is where now you start thinking with an attacker's mindset. Now you start to try to break stuff because you actually understand how things can be broken and how bad that can be, right? So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to follow execution paths. And now instead of, paying attention to how the thing works, now we go in much greater detail. We go more line by line and really questioning each thing of like, okay, this parameter is a uint 256. Now, what if I provided 0? What if I provided, the maximum uint value? What happens then? Or, thinking about these edge cases and taking more time to think about that and actually try to break stuff. This is where we use the toolbox. So use toolbox, and this is something that we're going to be building up, especially in weeks 4 through 8 is what we're going to be focusing on, building the toolbox so you know the different types of edge cases and things to use to attack the code base as you actually get into it, right? So this is where the stuff of like, okay, you understand reentrancy, you understand DOS, you understand gas griefing, and you know common edge cases, to think about, input 0 amounts, input single way amounts, or like really small amounts, to look for stepwise jumps in token values or something like this, to look for, all of these things, right? Which we'll get to, and we will get you all of those tools that you need, right? So this is the final step of everything. And now at this point, this is also when you want to go and implement your test cases, right? So as you're going through, you might notice that they have poor test coverage in some areas. This is where you want to fill that out, or especially you want to get into the fuzzing, which we will cover a little bit later on, is how to actually break down and identify invariants and then go and actually fuzz them. And that is a whole nother part of attack that is extremely undervalued, at least from what I see today. Fuzzing is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than manual analysis. So fuzzing is absolutely huge in this attack sector. But any questions on this attack section, and then I guess really the entire GTDA method we've gone through so far?
This might be irrelevant to the GTDA method, but I was wondering what you meant by the stepwise jumps in token value.
Yes, and this is something we will get you to see at a close-up level with some of the stuff we're going to have you work through. But essentially, if I have a system in which rewards are distributed or anything like this, you'll see commonly in DeFi systems, there'll be like a share of a pool, or this applies to many different systems, but we'll say there's a pool, you stake into a pool. For example, I can stake tokens and I get a certain share of the rewards or the pool value or something like this, right? So let's say I have a stake in a pool, and here's the value, and this is time. Now let's say rewards are added to the pool, and the value of the pool goes like this, and everybody in the pool who was staking made money. Well, what if I stake right before, literally front run it, and then unstake right here? Well, I get this delta of dollars risk-free. I didn't have to stake for this whole time. I didn't have to stake for this whole time. I just staked for this single, millisecond, or I staked for a single block even, and I got all that value. I can sandwich attack the actual reward compound that happens right here. So that's what I mean by stepwise jumps, and we'll get you to actually see what that looks like in practice. But that's honestly a very common one, because it's just a fundamental problem when we're trying to distribute rewards. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Does that happen in Uniswap pools? Like you can just add liquidity, like if there's like a big swap coming?
Yeah, that's that's the
Or
whole thing, like just-in-time liquidity, right? So in Uniswap, it's not nearly as like as malicious, but it is a thing, right? Like it's not distinct rewards that are being distributed. It's fees that are being charged on liquidities. But yeah, just-in-time liquidity is a thing. Yeah.
Like especially let's say in EV3 that maybe you provide liquidity in a very tight range.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
you get like the most out of it from a big swap, obviously.
That can only occur when those big swaps do exist. But yeah, there's a number of things that are technically toxic about, Uniswap v3 liquidity provision. But yeah, that is another whole thing that we could get into. But that's another similar application of this, right? That could honestly be like a medium finding if you're going to go and audit Uniswap. Of course, they know about it, and that's kind of they're saying it's like a feature, but it is a downside for LPs. Yeah. So cool. Let's talk about when we actually go and we go through our prepared audit, how we actually want to go and apply this, right? So first of all, you've gotten your prepared audit. What you're going to do is set aside some time to work on the prepared audit. Make sure you have no distractions during this time. Consider setting a timer, or at least just saying for the next 2 hours, I'm going to be doing this. Set up a notepad, right? Just set it up. It could be like this. It could be however you want it. And then I would say initially go through and get some initial context on the system. So just maybe do a once over on the contract, watch the video that we've got for you, read through the README, which has a brief overview. And then from there, you should be able to see, here's what the system aims to do. Now enumerate out all of those high-level goals. So in the Ethernote system, you can mint, you can redeem, things like that. Those are your initial goals. Then walk those code paths, right? Go through them, understand how it works. Don't pay attention line by line per se, but understand this is what this function is doing. And, these are the important lines of this function. Now, if you notice things, you have ideas or edge cases, put an audit tag there, right? And come back to it later. And do not get sucked into a rabbit hole until you understand the contracts. Now, this contract's not nearly as big as a full, complex DeFi system. So, it won't be too hard to get the context, but this gets more and more important as the code base gets larger and larger. So focus on the context, make those tags. And for this system, it's not hugely important to make a diagram because it is a system that you can hold in your brain all at one time. Lots of other systems are not that way. But maybe it would be good to get some reps, right? Making a diagram. Go try out Whimsical or use whatever software you're most familiar with and try to make a diagram of the flows that happen. And that might be helpful. And then finally get into attacking. Now, go through your audit tags, go through the interesting ones, and really just think about actual developer bugs, right? The most interesting findings, they don't have to do with just an obvious reentrancy attack or an obvious DOS attack or anything like this. The vast majority of them are just, logical errors that the developers made. And I'll tell you, for this prepared audit, it is just that. It's a logical error that the developers made. That is, it's not any type of vulnerability that I can just show you. It applies to the code base and to the code that they were writing. And it just gets you to see that, oh, this is what real critical vulnerabilities or, high vulnerabilities, whatever you would rank it as, looks like. And then finally, if you want to write some test cases for this, you can go ahead and do that. One other thing I'll add is POCs. When you do find a critical, it's good to go through and POC it. We talk about that in the prepared audit introduction sort of write-up that is there. Fuzzing, I would say do not worry about fuzzing for this prepared audit. This is something that's intended for you to find manually and go through, and there's a few things that you could point out. But yeah, no fuzzing for this one. We will get into fuzzing later. So that's how I would go through and attack the prepared audit. All right, so that is the GTDA method. I hope going through that was very useful for you, and I hope that you can actually go ahead and implement this in your own auditing approach. And I hope that seeing the security researchers' questions and my answers to those were helpful as well. Go ahead, try out this method, see if it works for you, iterate on it, make it work for you, and then get back to me. Let me know in the comments below if this method is working for you or if it's something that you're going to try out. And of course, also, if you're really interested in this security stuff, if you want to become a senior auditor in 6 months while avoiding as much of the trial and error as you possibly can that I have personally gone through, then I went down and in the description below, I put the 6 steps to become a senior auditor in 6 months. That's basically just distilling down what I see as the 6 important things that you've got to do to get from where you are right now to where you want to be as a senior auditor. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can go and you can grab that in the description. If it's not, then don't go in the description, don't grab it. That's totally fine. If you're also interested in connecting with other people around the world who also happen to be interested in this blockchain Web3 security thing, then you can feel free to go and apply to join our absolutely free community at lab.guardianaudits.com. And I hope to see you in there. So with that out of the way, I can't wait to see you next time.